Okay, so I'm going to try and knock out the rest of these E's. Probably not going to get much further than that here by the end of this school year. I'm going to try and it might read a little quickly, a little quicker, more quickly than I have done. I will try to keep some of my other commentary and explanation stuff at a minimum. Those of you who know me will know how difficult that will be. But there are several words kind of left, and a couple of them are kind of big, at least in terms of importance, I think. So a lot of these are going to come up in a lot of things. So I'm going to try and knock these out in a relatively decent time. So the first one we have up next is ethics, ethics. Ethics is the study of moral principles and behavior and of the nature of the good. One of the five classical fields of philosophical inquiry, as well as aesthetics, epistemology, logic, and metaphysics, also called moral philosophy. The term derives from the Greek word ethos, which implies both custom and character. Ethics as a discipline can be divided into normative ethics and metaethics, the first proposing principles of right conduct, the second inquiring into the usage and foundations of concepts such as right and wrong, good and evil. So normative ethics would be kind of like, these are things that you should do that are ethical. Metaethics are sort of looking into what is, sort of thing. You see meta, it's usually, especially people are throwing it around nowadays online, and it's a thing sort of in inquiring about itself is kind of where that's coming from. When we speak of ethics, we generally mean normative ethics, but metaethics has become steadily more important to philosophers, such an extent that most ethical theories of the past 2 centuries have had little to say about how one ought to act, but have instead questioned the role of ethics in life, the logical foundations of particular ethical systems, and their validity. In most systems, ethical conduct is seen in terms of personal fulfillment, pursuit of good, obligation to others or to accepted principles, regard for the right, or both. Personal fulfillment may derive from happiness or pleasure, or from the pursuit of an ideal, the good in itself or potential fully realized. Obligation commonly includes not only respect for others but for established norms, but also duty to God, whose injunctions constitute the ultimate authority for most moral systems throughout the world. God also, therefore, being defined in different ways across those other things around the world. Metaethics has its root in the thought of Socrates and Plato, who inquired into the nature of goodness as distinct from any particular good thing. In the Greek tradition, the central questions of ethics revolved around the general problem of what constitutes a life well lived, see virtue, rather than specific issues of right and wrong. The Stoics were the first to consider ethical decisions in terms of conforming to universal harmony and the divine will, an approach that is also basic to Judeo-Christian value systems. Come on. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant furthered metaphysics with his assertion of the categorical imperative, an absolute, universal, ethical principle that proposed a new foundation for the legitimacy of morality. Latter-day metaethical theories often deny the ethical validity of conventional morality. For instance, both Nietzsche's conception of slave morality and the Marxist notion of bourgeois morality view the dominant class as imposing its values on all of society. Other theorists have found the guarantee of ethical validity in social interaction rather than in the will of God or some other abstract highest good. Examples include John Dewey's conviction that moral questions can be resolved by careful inquiry, and Jürgen Habermas's belief that free, rational discourse can provide moral guidance for society. So ethics. We go ethnocentrism. It's definitely going to be sort of important what's going on around the world nowadays. Ethnocentrism, ethnocentrism, the tendency to judge other cultures according to the standards of one's own, and the belief that one's own ethnic or cultural group is superior to others. This isn't just in terms of country, it can also be sort of culture groups or sort of smaller societies within a larger one. So, even within United States, even within the same city, you can have several different perspectives of all that is, depending upon social economic status, ethnicity, and all these other things can lead to that. So centrism is, that sort of everything revolves around you, and your thing is the right and normal thing, and everything else can be judged whether it's good or not based on how much like your stuff it is. Also, a reminder, we've got more than 7 billion people who are all thinking that same thing too. The term was introduced by the American anthropologist William Graham Sumner in his book Folkways, 1907. It is generally applied to the Eurocentric viewpoint, so Europe being the sort of center of everything. But most societies display ethnocentric attitudes. Not only Europeans and their American descendants, but also the ancient cultures of China and Japan, for example, have traditionally viewed themselves as both the center and the culmination of social evolution, with the rest of the world ranged below this summit in descending degrees of progress and enlightenment. Through the 19th century, almost all Western history, writing, and social science began from ethnocentric assumptions. Oh boy, did they ever. Small-scale, non-Western societies were generally seen as primitive, to use the commonly applied term, less complex, less advanced, and less morally developed than European and Europe-derived societies. Primitive was the nice way a lot of the times. They usually said that. Savage is another word that might get used, and several rather ugly little racial epithets were thrown around as if that was just the scientific name for people's cultures. Modern cultural anthropologists studying pre-modern societies have been particularly sensitive to the dangers of ethnocentrism inherent in their discipline. Cultural relativism has arisen in reaction to ethnocentrism, arguing that beliefs, values, customs, and other cultural expressions must be understood and judged within their own context, rather than according to an outsider's theoretical preconceptions and classifications. In The Authoritarian Personality, 1950, T.A. Adorno and colleagues described ethnocentric hostility toward, quote, outgroups as characteristic of a personality type attached to rigid authoritarian conservative ideologies, which would not be considered scientific generally, and noted that extreme animosity toward ethnic minorities actually helps to cement a sense of in-group identification within the targeted groups. I'd also add within the groups that are doing the targeting as well. And also sometimes it's not even just the ethnicity, but also people who would show certain social characteristics as well. All right, so we're going to get into evolution. evolution. Evolution, biological theory that explains the emergence, proliferation, and transformation of the species, and the development of complex life forms from simpler ones in terms of subtle changes over long periods. Generally, any theory, for example, geological or cosmological, holding that change occurs gradually over time, as opposed to catastrophism and creationism. The theory of biological evolution is closely associated with Charles Darwin, who proposed that biological change occurs through natural selection, the adaptation of organisms to competitive conditions through the inheritance of beneficial traits. I would also remind people to be very careful how they deal with competition in this, because survival of the fittest does not mean kill or be killed, this BS law of the jungle crap that we have, that you've got to just stomp on everything and dominate. It's whatever fits best within a niche within the whole ecosystem. And the ecosystem, everything works together. Yes, you might have some animals that are predator and some animals that are prey, but those predator animals don't go and completely wipe out everything else just because they can. You can have predator animals sitting right there within reaching distance of prey animals, and if the predator animals are hungry or the prey animals aren't showing certain signs and triggering those responses, they're not going to attack them unless otherwise somehow provoked. So this whole law of the jungle, kill or be killed, eat everything that you can because you get, and everything, is crap. That's not what Darwinism or evolution should be. Another side note, I know I said I was not going to do this, but I'm going to do this a little bit. Gradualism only works so much. There are evidence in a whole lot of sciences that just a very strict line of gradual growth and evolution does not actually happen. That there are times of catastrophe or sort of jumps and mutations, or some sort of thing happens to either jumpstart something more or sweep the legs from it as well. So be careful of getting too much into the it's this or this. The idea that life on Earth evolves slowly is an ancient one, going back at least to the Greeks and Romans. Evolution was first seriously considered in the 18th century as scientific discourse began to be freed of theological strictures, and in the early 19th century a systematic theory began to emerge. The French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed that individual organisms' advantageous adaptations. Try that again. Let me just do that again. So you got that individual organisms, ownership, so S apostrophe. The individual organisms' advantageous adaptations to their environment can be passed on to their offspring. Where ultimately shown to be incorrect, this theory introduced the concept of inheritable traits, which became central to evolutionary theory. The principle of natural selection was first presented in 1858 in a paper by Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and more fully developed the following year in Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Darwin's model was influenced by the economic theory of his contemporary Thomas Malthus, who related population growth and decline to competition for scarce resources. Darwin applied that analysis to species in general. As environmental conditions on Earth change, organisms must change and adapt in order to survive. Survival in new circumstances requires successful competition for limited resources. Those best adapted for this competition will thrive and multiply, others will die out. The survival and propagation of species depends upon the constant, spontaneous emergence of fortuitous, inheritable traits or variations within populations. Darwin called the term unsolicited novelties. The traits that provide a competitive advantage help the individual survive to produce more offspring and therefore propagated with greater frequency than traits that are non-advantageous or deleterious, which eventually disappear from the population. Gradually, the new traits incorporated into the population give rise to a distinct different species, usually as a result of different populations of a species becoming isolated from each other. So sometimes, with the Galapagos Islands, they're, these different birds and these other things, same technical, like larger sort of thing, maybe a swallow or a sparrow, but their adaptations varied wildly depending upon which island they were on. So, this island had, this resource that they could do, and this island doesn't. So the ones that were able to fit best in that place to make use of that resource were the ones that pass on their genes, and the ones over here did the same, even though they might have eventually split even from a parental pair, like brother and sister, go to these other ones and have to adapt differently. And if they're able to make that adaptation, they can go on. Those traits and genes get passed. The mechanism by which traits emerge and are inherited remained the key point of dispute in evolutionary theory for many years. The genetic basis of heredity was established by the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel, important to know, Mendel, Gregor Mendel, in his experiments on varieties of peas in the 1850s and 60s, but was disregarded until 1900 because what he found flew in the face of what the existing paradigm said was the thing, so that got pushed aside until other people were able to be like, no, this has a thing. Mendel's findings demonstrated the principle of inheritance through what he called particulate factors, or genes. Indivisible units of information that are passed from one generation to the next. The discovery largely validated Darwin's theory, although disagreement persisted between the Darwinian view that evolution results from the gradual accretion of minute changes over extremely long periods, and the Mendelian view of evolution as a process of fits and starts in which radical changes appear within species and are either adopted or rejected in subsequent generations. By the mid-20th century, a majority of scientific community had accepted the gradualist view of evolution. With the discovery of the structure of DNA in the 1950s, the genetic mechanism for evolution was decisively established. Evolution is now seen in terms of changes in the genetic code that occur over time within a population of organisms. So there. Keep on plowing through. Existentialism, especially as you get older and maybe deal with people in college, you're going to get people who are going to shove certain amounts of this in your face as late teens and early college students and things like that. It's a very fashionable thing to be existentialist. It's very what you do. So Existentialism. So this is definitely something that you can see a root word in. Existentialism, exist. So there's the root word, where it all comes out of. It's a philosophical position holding that in an absurd universe, without intrinsic meaning or purpose, people have unlimited freedom of choice and must take absolute responsibility for their actions. In such a world, the individual is obliged to find meaning in his or her own existence, not in an externally imposed doctrine. So in other words, patriotism, or your country or your religion, which is all these things are externally imposed structures on you, and since the universe is sort of absurd and crazy and chaos and there's no actual underlying purpose or meaning to it, you have a responsibility to find the ethics and the purpose for your own life. The most succinct statement of the position is Jean-Paul Sartre's maxim, existence precedes essence. Our essential natures are developed through the choices we make in our lives. Our uncertain existence creates anxiety or, quote, existential dread, end quote, the fear of nothingness that brings us face to face with our own boundless, terrifying freedom and responsibility. In this predicament, the individual either chooses an authentic life or gives in to despair. The term existentialism was coined by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers as a derogatory term for Sartre, Martin Heidegger, and others from whom he wanted to separate his own basically existentialist view. Indeed, few thinkers called existentialists have accepted the designation. The first philosopher to whom the term is now applied was Søren Kierkegaard, who criticized the rationalism of Hegel and claimed that religious belief must be achieved through a, quote, leap of faith in the face of the world's fundamental absurdity. Heidegger introduced the concept of authenticity, the idea that humans may choose to act authentically, intelligently, and responsibly, wholeheartedly committing themselves to life and the development of their own true being, or inauthentically, afraid of exercising their freedom and sinking instead into mundane conformity. The existentialist viewpoint is ingeniously illustrated in Albert Camus, or Camus, C-A-M-U-S, it's Camus, essay, quote, The Myth of Sisyphus, from 1942. It's very depressing. In which he considers the Greek legend of the man condemned eternally to pushing a heavy stone uphill only to see it roll back down again and have to begin the futile task anew. Every human endeavor, Camus says, is characterized by this absurdity. Time erodes all achievements. Death cuts short our plans. Whatever purpose, meaning, or personal fulfillment we derive from our projects lies solely in our own commitment to them. The choice we make to keep pushing the rock uphill is what overcomes the nothingness of existence. It's a little bit light at the end of the tunnel, but honestly, yeah, the myth of Sisyphus is really depressing to read. Okay, we got a couple more here. Literally a couple more. The expanding universe. The theory that the universe is expanding in all directions, probably as a result of the Big Bang. Underline probably there. It's interesting to me, at least, that they say probably with that. It's just interesting. It began with the discovery that the nebula, once thought to be gaseous clouds just beyond the Milky Way galaxy, are, in fact, other galaxies, some of them at immense distances from our own. In the 1920s, American astronomer Edwin Hubble observed a redshift in the light coming from the Andromeda Nebula. That is, the light's frequency is shifted toward the red in the spectrum, indicating that its source is moving away from us. In fact, from the Earth's perspective, the whole universe appears to be moving away from us. Hubble hypothesized that the universe is expanding and the galaxies are expanding along with it. If as a thing, so this is sort of, think of the Doppler effect. So if you hear a sound and someone's coming away, it's a car, and as it comes in, it gets louder, and then as it goes, it gets quieter again. That's what the red or blue is doing to us. So when we detect a red shift, that's this part of it where it's moving away. If it was blue shift and everything coming in this way, then the light would be blue shifted, and then we know that the universe is kind of condensing, which doesn't mean that there wasn't a Big Bang. It means that, potentially there was a Big Bang and everything exploded, but all the gravity and all the stuff in the universe was such that it slowed down, stopped, and then is pulling everything back in. According to Hubble's theory, other galaxies are receding in relation to us in proportion to their distance from us. This concept is usually illustrated with the image of a balloon with dots drawn on the surface. As the balloon is inflated, the observer sitting on any one of the dots would see every other dot moving away, and the farther away it is, the faster it would seem to be moving. Thus, although it appears that we are at the center of the universe expanding away from us in all directions, this is not the case. All the dots are moving away from each other. Hubble's distance velocity formula is used to measure the distance of a galaxy from the Earth. It has also been used to estimate the age of the universe, now thought to be between 10 and 20 billion years old. You kind of more nailed around the 14 to 15 billion year range. More than a decade before, Hubble, an early version of Einstein's general theory of relativity, had predicted an expanding universe. Einstein, however, did not believe it. There was at the time no evidence for an expanding or contracting universe, so he modified his formula, sorry about that, by introducing an arbitrary factor known as the cosmological constant to counteract the effect predicted by his theory. He later termed this, quote, the greatest blunder of my life, end quote. Although there could be something to that if we change the name from cosmological content to dark matter and dark energy, the combination of which takes about 96% of our universe. I think dark energy is supposedly, last I heard, roughly 73% of our universe. Dark matter is roughly 23% of our universe. The stuff that we can see and live on and do with and everything else like that is only approximately 4% of our total universe. Fun. All right, I believe this is the last one. I don't know how much you're really going to need this, but you might. So I don't know. It might be something that comes up because it is a little popular. and was somewhat sort of kind of a big thing for a while. So Expressionism, Expressionism, an artistic style practiced especially in drama and the fine arts in the early 20th century, in which the artist expresses internal emotions, usually by distorting normal forms and perspectives. Expressionism contrasts with approaches such as Impressionism, in that the artwork is an externalization of an inner landscape, often turbulent, rather than an internalization and interpretation of external stimuli. So impressionists, if you think like Monet, like the flower, like the water lilies and stuff. So it's all the little dots and the different colors and the dots, and you look out, it's like this picture where you look in, it's just like these little dots that he put in. So it's an interpretation of what's going on in there. Expressionists are united not by a coherent ideology or a consistent style, but by an anguished worldview expressed in troubling images. While artists from many periods have been labeled expressionists, including El Greco in the 16th century, Picasso in the period that produced his tortured anti-war painting Guernica, 1937, and the so-called neo-expressionists who flourished in the 1980s, including German Jörg Beslitz and the American Julian Schnabel. Expressionism is primarily associated with Northern and Central European artists in the years before and after World War I. Modern Expressionism had roots in the stylized landscapes of German Romantic painting, in the dynamic colors and expressive lines of the symbolist painters, especially Vincent van Gogh, or Vincent van Gogh, or Vincent van Gogh. I've heard all three. I'm not entirely sure which one's the correct. America, we usually say Vincent van Gogh. I've heard Vincent van Gogh from like Britain, things like that, and Van Gogh as well. And in the bold simplicity of African and Pacific island sculpture, all presenting imposing forms with a dramatic intensity. The term was coined in 1901 by the painter Auguste Herve, Herve, to describe his own anti-impressionist work. The earliest and perhaps definitive modern expressionist was the Norwegian Edvard Munch, whose haunting woodcut The Scream, 1893, evokes existential terror in a nightmarish landscape. German Expressionism was embodied by two artist groups called Die Brücke, the bridge, and Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider, founded in 1905 and 1911 respectively. Die Brücke described itself as attracting all the elements of revolution and unrest and exploring modern humanity's sense of alienation, anxiety, and tormented spirituality, came to represent the qualities associated with Expressionism as a whole. The artists of Der Blaue Reiter were more concerned with mysticism and spirituality, locating the source of inspiration in the imagination rather than the emotions. The dominant figures in each group were Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and the Russian-born Vasily Kandinsky, respectively. Other important Expressionist artists include names you're going to make me say. I don't know if you're really going to need to know any of these. Emil Nolde, Käthe Kollwitz, Max Beckermann, Jörg Gross in Germany, Egon Schiele and Oskar Kokoschka in Austria, Joris Roald, Rouault, that one's hard, in France, and Max Weber in the United States. You also see abstract expressionism and later things. Expressionism in the theater was foreshadowed in the late 19th century in the plays of August Strindberg and Frank Wedekind, both of whom worked in highly symbolic, emotionally charged version of naturalism, dramatizing emotions more than ideas and events. Actually, this kind of reminds me of David Lynch. Expressionistic drama was often rebellious, challenging bourgeois conventions and social injustices. Stylized devices such as heightened speech, masks, and heavy symbolism were used, for example, by Eugene O'Neill in his plays in the 1920s. Stark, distorted scenery and shadowy lighting reflected the influence of Expressionist painting, which also stimulated an Expressionist cinema of hallucinatory images and eccentric camera angles, especially in Weimar Germany, exemplified by the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1919. All right, that is the end of the E's. That's probably all I'm going to get to. The school year is ending for us, so I hope some of these were helpful. At the very least, to give people who need stuff for tests an idea of something in case it's not gotten in class, or it is something that might help kind of enhance some of the studies again in history and civics and government and science, and maybe even in some of the art stuff like music or art or anything too. So all right, good luck.